Hello.
Hello, hello.
Hi there.
So we're still waiting for some of the members. We'll give it a few more minutes and then we'll get started. Hannah, do we know if anyone has contacted to say that they will not be here?
I have not had anyone contact me to say that they could not attend.
I know that Russ Cox will not be on this call, but he will be at the meeting.
Okay, so possibly Russ not here.
I'm sorry, I can't hear anything.
Amy said that Russ would not be on the call.
And I keep thinking Chris Girdler said that he was not going to be able to take this call today, but would be in attendance next week too.
I do show that we are a little bit after 4 o'clock. So if we want to begin, just to be respectful of everyone's time, since we do not have any action, if we do not have a quorum, I believe we could continue. And then hopefully others will join as they become available. Pam, are you okay with that? Okay, Pam,
I'm
can you
okay
hear me?
with it. We want to get
Okay.
started.
Okay,
I think she's having trouble with her headset, it looked like, or something.
she is.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's okay. I can go ahead and get us kicked off here. I will go ahead and call the roll. So please let me know if you are here. Barry Martin. I do see Keith Hamilton is here.
Here.
Brianna Witten.
Present.
Thank you. Russell Cox. Does not look like he's with us yet. Karen Finan. Not seeing Karen. Chris Girdler. Kimberly Green.
Here.
Thank you, Kimberly. Joe Herdink.
Here.
Thank you. Leah Hodges. Do not see her yet. She may be joining shortly. Alexandra I'm sorry, I skipped Dr. Patsy Jackson.
Here.
Thank you, Patsy. Alexandra Martin.
Here.
Thank you. Good to see you. Candace McGraw, she is our new member. I do not believe she's going to be on the call today. Kelly Rabinowitz. And James Lee Stevens. To see you,
Right.
James Lee. Thank you. Okay, we'll go ahead and begin. And hopefully others will join as they are able, but I do, because we are going to have this meeting led by Huron, want to turn it over to them so that they can provide updates on all of their work.
Great. Thank you. I'll go ahead and begin by sharing my screen here. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having us. Today, we are going to be providing an update on the majority of the update on the compensation and equity workstream. So the agenda for today, we're going to begin by providing a high-level compensation workstream update. Then the majority of the time is going to be dedicated to the employee impact analysis, the preliminary results of that. Also, during this engagement, we began and concluded the HR assessment, which was an extension of work to the specific workstream. So we will provide an update on the findings of that HR assessment. And then we will wrap up with an update on the optimization workstream. So that should take us through the next 2 hours. So the first agenda item is the compensation workstream update. So the compensation and equity workstream has 6 distinct steps. We have been making our way through these steps since the beginning of this engagement, which was January. So we began by identifying a compensation philosophy, which we shared with all of you. We developed a job classification framework for staff. And we created job profiles and mapped current KCTCS positions to the new job profiles that have been created. At the same time, we were working on the compensation playbook, which we have taken that playbook to various stakeholders, gathered feedback, and we are now updating. So that playbook has made its way through the HR peer team, the specific advisory committee, as well as the PLT. So based off of the feedback that we've gathered, we are making modifications and we'll be finalizing that in the next couple of weeks. We have also market priced both faculty and staff jobs and proposed a new pay structure for both faculty and staff. And then today we'll be sharing with you the employee impact analysis, at least the first part of it. And then shortly after, the next meeting is going to be dedicated to sharing the equity analysis, which is the second part of the employee impact analysis. So this slide gives you an idea of where we are, where majority of the work is underway, and we are wrapping up this engagement through the evaluation of the employee impact analysis. So since the last board meeting, the workstream group has completed the position mapping phase and finalized the draft of the compensation playbook. Just to take you through some of the specific details and work that took place, the position mapping and validation phase, Huron really began that by conducting training for all 16 colleges in the system office. We also provided preliminary mapping for approximately 2,300 staff positions. And Huron, in partnership with KCTCS stakeholders, identified faculty discipline using zip codes, and the KCTCS HR leadership was able to communicate a lot of this framework, the architecture that was built, and the fundamentals around it to college leadership. And based off of that education, they were able to revise the original mapping that was done by Huron. So the position mapping directly impacts the analysis that you will see here today. Also, we conducted what we call a calibration of position mapping, and that's really to ensure that there's consistency across the system for individuals performing the same job, to make sure that they are mapped accurately and consistently when, again, the responsibilities are the same. So that's the pre-calibration process that took place, and then Huron was able to finalize the mapping in preparation for the employee impact analysis. At the same time, we also were working on the compensation playbook, which is really that salary administration guide that helps inform for the future what types of approvals take place and some of the guidance around specific compensation actions. So all of that information is contained in the compensation playbook. Like I mentioned in the previous slide, this was shared with different stakeholders, and we are in the process of finalizing based off of all the feedback that's been received. We also conducted market pricing. So in parallel to the position mapping phase, Huron market priced and anchored approximately 450 jobs. That includes the newly created job profiles as well as faculty jobs, and developed pay structures to inform the employee impact analysis that you will see here. Huron primarily used Coupa, which is a higher education salary survey, as the primary source of data. Also market priced using Comp Analyst survey data to incorporate general industry when relevant. So we reviewed and anchored approximately 21% of the job profiles due to the lack of external data, which is pretty standard, that about 80% of the jobs would have market prevalent or market data, and then the rest would be assigned based off of where other jobs or like jobs have been priced. And we did adjust grade assignments to ensure smooth transitions, and developed a staff and faculty pay structure, which we'll go over here in detail in a second. So when it comes to the timeline, what really we are focusing on sharing preliminary results. We shared that with the PLT last week, and we're sharing the same information with all of you today. After the conclusion of this meeting, we are already started the process of conducting the equity analysis, and there will be one more meeting both with the PLT and with all of you as the board to share the equity analysis and some of the proposed revision to the faculty pay structure, which again, we'll go over here in a second. And then the specific work stream will conclude in early October. So I'm going to pause right there before we go to the second agenda item, which is the employee impact analysis, and see what questions that you have around the work that's taken place up to this point.
A quick question. So how do you grade or analyze same positions but performance differences? So, they're neither are managers, they're both in the same sort of ideal lineup, but there are performance differences between the two people, even though there's no class change of the two individuals. How is that maturated in this process at all, or is it?
So when it comes to performance, we want to make sure that that's accounted for within the range. So as long as an individual possesses or is in a job, they should be paid within the range, the minimum and the maximum that's been assigned for that given job. Now, their performance, whether someone is a high performance or a mediocre performer, that would take place when it comes to their specific position within that range. And we do have some guidance in the compensation playbook to outline positioning of an employee based off of performance, based off of knowledge and the experience they bring to the job, and those different elements, those tend to take place within range positioning over where exactly the grade is that would be assigned to the job.
Okay. Is that a complicated nuance, or is that sort of standard practice based on the studies that you do?
Yeah, I would say that's standard practice, that performance comes into play when it comes to position and range. If an individual holds a job, so if there's an employee that is an accountant 3, as an example, and there's another employee that's an accountant 3, we want to make sure that we value the job of what an accountant typically would make and assign the grade based on that. And then what the individual brings to that specific job would vary, and the range would be wide enough to account for different factors like performance. So we would account for that in that way.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Regent Herding?
Yeah, with the playbook, when will we have access to view the playbook?
Yeah, so the playbook should be finalized in the next couple of weeks. We'll be able to share some of the high-level outcomes of the playbook or some of the decisions that have been made in the final presentation. But we have vetted that the playbook, so day-to-day operations around that through the PLT, the advisory group, and then the HR peer team. So we can certainly share some of the findings or decisions that were made around day-to-day operations with all of you in the final presentation.
Okay, I was just interested to see the actual playbook itself. If it's the actual
okay.
a document or something that's going to be somewhere, that
Yes.
we as region would have access to view that. Thank you.
Yes, yeah, we can make that available to you, Pam, and then we can figure out a way to.
Right, and to clarify, going one step further, once it is finalized, that is an employee public document, so you will be able to see that. But my understanding, Regent Herding, is that you're asking prior to the finalization, will you see it? And yes, you will.
Thank you.
And Pam, this is Brianna. Quick question. Just want to make sure. So I think what I heard you say is that the changes will be marked in the final version that we do receive. So Huron, I know the PLT came out with it. They probably made some changes or adjustments to things. Will the board be able to see all of those changes and adjustments that were made in the draft that we get?
So I'm going to defer to Calcadon on where we are on the versions, but the fact of the matter is all of the HR directors have weighed in over a period of time, so I don't know if those would be captured. But when the draft, which it's in draft form right now, goes to the PLT and then to the board, those should be captured, but I cannot say with certainty whether all of the changes from the very beginning of the draft would be captured.
Yeah, I would say that's accurate. And a lot of these modifications are also based off of, better understanding of the institution or some of the operations that takes place. So the revision from one version to another is mostly based off of our better understanding and making it more appropriate for the institution. So it's more changes around that versus should we do X or Y? But we can certainly ensure that, some of the major changes have been called out. And we do have some slides around that to really showcase, these were the things that were being discussed and it landed in this way. And I think those would be really important. And those are the ones that we really want to make sure that we have the board's understanding in the final presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So with that, let's go into the second agenda item, which is the employee impact analysis. So prior to going into the analysis, we really want to kind of level set with what we typically expect and why the results came out the way they did. So the first one is really focused on the distribution or market alignment. So an organization should normally be distributed around its market target. So based on past discussions, KCTCS aligned on a target market slightly below the 50th percentile, and really focusing on being competitive using the total rewards package as a whole. So a holistic view of total rewards versus just compensation. So with that, the target percentile is slightly below 50th percentile, but that would then represent the midpoint of the range. So the range would have a minimum, midpoint, and maximum. Most employees should be clustered around the midpoint because that would represent, again, your target market. Those that tend to be below the midpoint or towards the minimum of the range would be those that are early in their careers, or perhaps performance. The question earlier, low performers would tend to be lower in the range, but still within the range because they are performing the job. Those that are high performers, those that have high level of knowledge and contributing at a higher high degree would be in the above the midpoint or higher in the range, so experienced employees. But this gives you a picture in which we're going to see how this is going to look for both staff and faculty. But what we would want to see, or ideally, is that majority of the employees would be around the midpoint, which is your target market. The second point we want to make is around two key concepts that are required to understand the market analysis. We're really going to be focusing on range penetration throughout the presentation, but comp ratio is also another measure or concept that could be used. Starting off with range penetration, that's really how far into the range an employee is located. So if an employee is making an hourly $22 an hour, that would be the distance into the range. So that divided by the total range spread. So they will be 12% into the range. If it's 0%, that represents that they are at the minimum of the range. If they're at 50%, that would be the midpoint. And if they're at 100%, that would be the maximum. So that gives you an idea of the different milestones or pillars. So 12% into the range in this specific example. So again, if we're around 50%, that would mean that they're around that target market. So we're going to be referring to range penetration going forward in this presentation. And then the third point that we want to make is around the market analysis results, and that is heavily dependent on the data strategy an institution decides to take. So we've spent a lot of time discussing early on around the compensation philosophy, the market data strategy, geographic differentials. So all of those decisions in alignment is what led to this, the results of this analysis. So just to as a reminder of some of the decisions that have been made, the first one is around the market data strategy, where KCTCS is comparing itself to other two-year institutions and taking a regional look geographically. But knowing that KCTCS competes with other institutions, two-year institutions in neighboring states like Ohio and Indiana, that's been added as part of that. So there is an academic peer group that is being compared, general industry added when necessary or when data is available, but then primarily comparing itself to two-year institutions. The other thing to note is around geographic differentials, where each of the 16 colleges and then the system office has been assigned a geographic differential based off of the cost of labor. So you will see the geographic differentials assigned by location. And so that would mean that the pay structure that is being proposed is adjusted to account for the cost of labor. And then last is the target market. So I said slightly below the 50th percentile based off of past alignment. And so what's being targeted is the 40th percentile of market. And so when we get to methodology, the market data and approach, KCTCS jobs were compared against higher education salary surveys and general industry where relevant. And so staff and faculty jobs were evaluated using the 40th percentile, like I mentioned in the previous slide, of the College and University Professional Association for Human Resources, or CUPA HR salary survey. but then using 50th percentile of market when looking at general industry for comp analysts, because the survey provider has 25th, 50th, or 75th percentile. So the closest one was 50th percentile. Approximately 65% of KCTCS jobs, both staff and faculty, are benchmarked using Coupa data, higher education. And then approximately 40% of the staff jobs are benchmarked using comp analyst or general industry. The two tables below you see showcases the data prioritization, where we are weighting Coupa and comp analyst 50-50%, so both of them having equal weights. And the data cut is we use the KCTCS academic peer group. And if data is not available, we used all two-year institutions. You will see the effective date listed there. Comp analyst was not aged, but Coupa data was aged to account for the annual wage movement because the last available data is from November 2022. 2023 data has not been released yet. For faculty, you'll see the same layout there as well, also aged to account for the annual wage movement for faculty as well. Okay. And one more slide and I'll pause for questions. So the other thing, the other component that plays a big role in overall market alignment and market positioning is the structures, pay structures. So there are two pay structures already in place right now, one for staff, one for faculty. For staff, we did make adjustments or proposing an adjustment to the staff pay structure. There will be and some of the modifications to call out that have been made is the range spread is more consistent. Based on past modifications that have been made, the midpoint truly wasn't the midpoint, and that the spread between the min and the mid and the mid and the max were not even. So there was more of a shift based off of past modifications or adjustments. We're able to smooth that out. Also being able to adjust the spread from band 1 to 20 by having narrow ranges and having it expand or increase in spread as we get lower, or as we get higher in the band. So slight modifications based off of what we would typically see as leading practice for pay structures. When it comes to faculty, that is probably the biggest change here. Initially, we did hear there's a strong desire for KCTCS stakeholders to consider discipline for faculty compensation. So we've discussed that in the past. And based off of that, we also assigned zip codes to indicate the type of discipline a faculty member is aligned to make sure there's differentiation there. Now, after looking at Coupa data, again, taking into account the comparison groups that was selected previously, we saw minimal difference in market rate between disciplines within the same rank. So specifically, an instructor in nursing versus an instructor in English within, again, our comparison group, the two-year institutions, there was minimal difference, and most of them were ending up in the same grade. For that reason, Huron does recommend reevaluating the use of discipline due to the lack of differentiation by other two-year institutions. And so this was, we did have a discussion around this with the PLT last week as well. Wanted to get your thoughts around really making a modification to the pay structure that was proposed for faculty and going to that 1 through 5 pay bands, but then making adjustment to the current structure so that the spread is a little bit more narrow. Currently, it's about on average, a 70% spread, making it a little bit narrower, but also aging it appropriately and making sure that the midpoint represents the target market that's also used for staff, which is slightly below the 50th percentile of market. So I'll pause right there and see what questions that you have either around this pay structures or around some of the methodology that was discussed in previous slides. Regent Jackson?
Yes, thank you. I have a question. Can you share the date range for the data and the evidence that you looked at to determine differentiation between the disciplines? For example, what we would consider hard to fill positions.
Mhm.
Did you look at data when you looked at instructor of nursing versus an instructor of English from 2 or 3 years ago, or was this like current live data differentiation?
Yeah, so to be able to see the differentiation, instead of focusing on it internally, we looked at external data using Coupa data, higher education. And so we wanted to see what the differentiation would be by discipline. And those disciplines, specifically the discipline that exists at KCTCS. So we did take an internal look to see, okay, what are the specific disciplines that exist at KCTCS? Let's take those two zip codes, pull in the most recent available data that we have from Coupa, which was as of November 2022, and see what is the difference in those based off of the 2-digit zip codes in faculty compensation. And we saw, based off of that, and the data cut used is 2-year institutions instead of 4-year institutions, because that's been identified as the primary competitors for KCTCS. And that's where we didn't see the differentiation in pay. So to answer your question, primarily using Coupa, effective date November 2022, and then discipline across using zip codes.
Yeah, that would be one I would say I would really ask that we use caution, because I think looking at this geographically, from being in the college, we have identified a tremendous disparity in being able to hire some of these hard to fill positions. So I would just be very cautious. I would be reserved actually to think that we could effectively, I guess, predict that with what we're actually seeing on the ground in the colleges. So I realize the data you're talking about, and I appreciate that, but I think the reality, particularly in some of these locations that geographically are harder to recruit to anyway, I think we definitely are seeing that disparity. So I would just add that to the conversation and the consideration.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's definitely a fair point. And although it's not clearly seen in the data, we certainly understand, and we've gotten a lot of feedback from our HR partners as well, the HR directors and leaders. And so what we would say is, there are ways to be able to think about the different recruiting challenges, the retention, by even having guideline on, okay, we now have this range that's been age adjusted, but targeting certain quartiles, perhaps the first quartile as a new hire for hard to recruit disciplines, knowing that, we've seen that in practice at KCTCS or even other institutions or competitors, and being able to have specific guidelines based off of that. I think that's one of the things that we can recommend and have it be outlined in the compensation playbook, so that there is consistency that could be applied across the system, using quartiles for both hiring, promotion, etc.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Regent Stevens?
Yes, ma'am. Maybe that one of my concerns is that looking at this as you go through, and maybe you'll get to it later, is in the process. What about years of service for faculty in those positions as well as staff in those bands? One of the concerns that I have is because that we've heard stories in the past that a faculty member has taught in a specific position for 15 years, and then a new staff member with the same credentials is hired in because it's a hard position to fill at the same price. So have you looked at that? Are you going to look at that as the years of service in those bands, not only for the staff, but the faculty?
Yeah, so years of service is certainly one of the components in addition to performance, in addition to actual years of experience, applied knowledge to the job. And institutions, tend to take a different approach or have emphasis on one over another. For the faculty one, that tends to be a lot more prevalent than staff. So years and rank tends to play a much more structured role in faculty compensation over staff. So with the revision of the faculty pay structure, which we are recommending based off of this, lack of differentiation and discipline, that could be one of the scenarios that we can take a look at to ensure that based off of years of service or years and rank, where should they be relative to their peers in the range. And that could be one of the costing scenarios that we'll be able to provide because, again, we're recommending a reduction in the number of bands for faculty versus what you see displayed here. For staff, we would be I do hear a little bit of an echo. Okay. I think it's gone now. But for staff, we would recommend more of a pay for performance model, or being able to have other components play a larger factor than faculty. But again, that's something to consider when we think about compression. And we will get into that here shortly when we start looking at market alignment and being able to prioritize position and range first, or making sure employees are paid within the pay range, and then being able to bring in compression into play as we consider years of service. So to answer your question, really, we tend to see that much more on the faculty side, and specifically years and rank to account for range positioning over staff. But again, that's something that we can certainly take a look at. Regent Jackson?
I just have one more comment really quickly, please. And I guess to try not to sound like a broken record, because I've mentioned this several times and we've kind of alluded to it, but I've yet to really see it in writing unless I'm missing something. And that is the comment that I shared very early on about as we look at where faculty or staff are positioned currently, and we begin to consider applying, the comp compression and all this equalization or equity analysis, is the process of actually looking at the true base salary of faculty for consideration versus the salary, and I'll use faculty as an example because but it applies to staff too. But to actually look at where the faculty or staff salary is truly, with things like meritorious pay skimmed off the top. And I say that because, again, to me, it just looks very obvious that the very thing you alluded to with bringing someone on new to where someone with 15 years experience would be, and kind of making that look equal based on this formula of a band, does not take into consideration the fact that a salary that belongs to a faculty or staff may be higher for reasons other than just base salary. The meritorious service was something that person did above and beyond the job. So to me, we almost have to skim that off and look at where someone is in their true salary, because if not, we're going to be bringing people up to where someone meritorious is without that person actually recognizing meritorious service. And again, I've kind of mentioned that. I know this is of interest to faculty that I represent, and we've talked about it, and I kind of understood later on that would be considered, but we're kind of getting toward the end, and I haven't really seen that as outlined in process. And maybe it's here and we're not to it yet, but I really want us to look at that, or someone explain to me why that would not be important, because I see that as creating a major inequity moving forward if we do not do that.
Yeah, and to make sure, and please let me know if I'm not understanding the question or the concern there, but we really are looking at base salary when comparing faculty pay. And even in the upcoming slides, when we're thinking about market positioning and being able to revise the pay structure, we're absent of any kind of supplemental pay, truly looking at base pay. We're not considering any kind of overload either. It truly is the base pay and comparing faculty members to ensure that their market aligned to the target market that's been selected.
Yeah, and I do understand that. And you guys are looking at it from the outside, I guess, and giving us some foundation or baseline to start on. And I think this is going to have to be more internal to KCTCS about us being able to look at our own faculty and staff and determining what truly is the base of this person. Because what appears in PeopleSoft, let's say, or wherever that, all the places that would be stored, that particular base of somebody may be inclusive of meritorious pay. So if we do not take that off and actually look where someone is, I know that's added to base, but if not, that's what has created some of these gaps in salary. Perhaps it is because people have earned meritorious that was added to their base year after year. So that has created a gap, but is that something, that's not wrong necessarily if that person earned meritorious pay, but it's created something that appears to be an inequity. But do we kind of ignore that was because of meritorious pay and actually bring new people up or people within a band up, because then you're negating the whole purpose of earning meritorious pay. You see what I'm saying?
Hey, Patsy, I mean,
Yes.
I know we've talked about this a lot. I guess I don't know how you can across the board look at that. I mean, I think what we're going to have to rely on is the staff members, pointing that out to their supervisors if they're impacted that way. And the same token, what if somebody got an increase that they shouldn't have? I mean, if we went across the board and we increased everybody by that same amount, there may be increases for people that didn't deserve it. So I think we're going to have to look at that instant by instant. I don't think there's a quick fix to that across the board, or I don't see it.
I'll piggyback on what Patsy's saying, because those merit bonuses were tied to the PPE performance, and that was an exceeds expectations. It seems to me that would be something that would be easily pulled.
It is.
Personnel records.
The meritorious did not always exist, Chair Martin. So I've talked to Buddy Combs about this. For the window of time that meritorious actually added value to the salaries of people, there are people that can be identified based on their ratings very quickly through a query, most likely, of who was impacted by that. And I just hope that is looked at some point, because if not, I think that is going to potentially negate meritorious service if everybody's kind of going to just be moved up into a band, so to speak. But I just want to share that I've shared it, and that's almost
So
it.
just to piggyback on what Calcadon said, that these positions, when you look at the position, you look at the position and you determine what band it goes into. Once you've determined what band it goes into, then you look at the other factors, which will be the service, the length of it, the performance level, all of that. So don't think that when you take someone to a particular band, that everyone's going to, as Calcadon was saying, go into a range of penetration that is identical to everyone else's. You're going to penetrate that range based on all of these other factors that are set out in the compensation playbook, and will be also reiterated in policy and procedure.
Thank you, Pam.
I got a quick question. This is Keith. So, I have a great appreciation for, the data that's presented and where you got the data from and how it was collected. I'm curious on the other side of that, the execution side, as an HR person within the organization is evaluating each of these individual people for their performance evaluation. Is it going to be this nuanced going forward of, several boxes have got to be checked and analyzed for time of service, individual performance, where their pay started, what the end objective is for a salary position? I'm just trying to figure out from the execution after this is agreed on, how will you analyze and effectively evaluate someone without having all of this huge data point to sort of pick from item by item to say, hey, here's what we ended up with, if you understand my question.
Yeah. There's definitely a lot of components, and I think it's really important to have, that compensation playbook play a major role in providing the necessary guidance. And there's going to be different scenarios. So I will say there's a lot of consideration that, the HR will have to, in partnership with leadership, really have to evaluate to ensure that an employee is positioned appropriately within the range. So if, as an institution, though, there needs to be a prioritization of saying, the first step is truly to ensure that anybody who is below the range, or even outside of the range, that we have clear guidance to make sure that as long as they're performing the job, they are paid within the range. Okay. The second priority would be making sure that those that maybe it's related to performance, right? Those that are really high performers are paid in this quartile of this range. And so I would say having priorities in the objective and having it be applied consistently across the system will play a major role. But I will say it's really important to consider all these factors, and it is nuanced. And I think that's where the art comes in compensation. But we try to make sure that there is as much guidance and structure in place so that that can be justified in the decisions that are made when it comes to employee compensation.
Is there any training within your module for the evaluating staff to be able to accurately decipher and make these decisions based on these data points? I mean, are they going to be trained on how to transition from the old model that might have had 2 or 3 categories to evaluate to say, hey, this is a high performer? With this level of data, there might be 10 data set points that they need to sort of evaluate to make sure they're making the right decision on whether to promote them or move them up to higher of the scale, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So since the beginning of this engagement, we've had a working group meeting. We've had a work stream lead group that's been really meeting on a weekly basis since January. We've been working very closely in establishing this framework to making sure that there is that understanding. Throughout this engagement, we've had several training when it comes to how to think about position mapping, how to think about job profiles. And then we plan on having also a transitional meeting with all of the data after the presentations that we have, to make sure that there is a point person to ensure that they understand the data, the compensation playbook, and there will be training in that. So throughout this, we have definitely been in close contact with that group that's been working with us since the very beginning. And they're also, HR professionals that have this background knowledge, and we think that the transition would go over very smoothly. So we've been trying to, be very intentional from the beginning, and we'll continue to do so going forward.
Okay, thank you.
So with that, if we take a look at the market positioning, so like I showed previously in the overview, the first overview slide, if you remember what we typically would like to see versus how the range penetration is looking for KCTCS. This is for staff specifically. So about 26% of the staff population are paid below the new range minimum. Again, that's using the new pay structure that is being proposed. About 65% of employees are paid within the assigned pay range. So we would want 100% of employees to be paid within the pay range, right? Where they fall in the range, again, varies on those different factors that we talked about. And then there are employees that are above the range maximum. For those that are above the range maximum, we are not recommending a pay decrease of any kind. However, in the compensation playbook, there is some wording around, possible future increases and what that would look like if someone is above their assigned pay range maximum. There are ways that we typically see in practice by other institutions, and that is lump sum payment as opposed to an increase to their base salary or base pay. Another thing to call out here is majority of the employees that are below the range minimum do have a blend of higher education and general industry data. So again, one of the early decision points was for jobs like HR, IT, legal, those shared services jobs that you would be competing with others outside of higher education, meaning the general industry. That data has incorporated, and we know typically general industry pays more than higher education. So you will see that those that who fall below the range minimum tend to have both a higher ed and general industry blend data. And employees with the largest raise to minimum cost should definitely be evaluated further to ensure position mapping is accurate. Again, all of this is information based off of the position mapping exercise that took place. So there could be modifications. And we know also since the last time the position mapping took place, there's turnover that happened, new hires, reclassification. So, this is evolving data, but this is just directionally gives you an idea of where staff is positioned at KCTCS with this new pay structure. Then we take a look at faculty. So this will, I will say this will change because of the pay structure that was initially proposed under the assumption that discipline will play a major factor. But with the revision to the pay structure, this distribution will look very different. But based off of the information that was shared, about 72% of employees, specifically faculty, are paid within their assigned pay range. 24% of the faculty members have a range penetration above 100%, meaning they're above the maximum of the range. So using, one thing to call out here is that using the current KCTCS structure, if you remember, we presented this in February at the board meeting. 85% of faculty members were paid below the midpoint. So majority were very in Q1, Q2, the first quartile, second quartile of the existing or current range. However, that looks very different here. So you will probably see at the next final presentation, a lot of the faculty members moving towards the beginning or the Q1, Q2 because of the modification that will be made. So take this as very much a preliminary data result. And so due to the minimal difference seen in the market rate by discipline, like I mentioned previously, meaning the peer group, Huron does recommend adjusting the current structure by reducing the range spread, aging to account for annual wage movement, and maintaining the bands that currently take place, but again, making modifications. So a total of 4 to 5 bands versus the 10 that was proposed to account for discipline. So that will be a change that will be seen at the next presentation. But again, giving you an idea of what this would look like based off of the pay structure that was shown in the previous slide. Main callouts here or opportunities. The first one is the pay structure revision. We don't recommend additional revision to the structure that you saw for staff. Again, it's adopting leading practice by considering appropriate range spreads, midpoint progressions, and consistency in the application or changes between bands or grades. The proposed pay structure for faculty should be revised based on the alignment on the use of faculty discipline, which is really to go to that 4 to 5 band, but then adjusting it appropriately to account for the annual wage movement and appropriate range spreads based on the market target that has been selected. Once we are aligned on that, we'll be able to provide a new data, market alignment data analysis for you all at the next presentation. When it comes to range placement, employees that are below and above the range should be further evaluated to ensure position mapping is accurate. And also being able to have clear guidelines in the compensation playbook for employees who are outside of the range, which we already have a draft of for future administration. So those that are below the range, what does it mean to bring them up to the range minimum? Those that are above the range maximum, how does that look like going forward when there is an annual increase that takes place? The top priority should be to ensure employees who are below the range minimum are paid at least at the pay range minimum. So if they are performing the job, they should at least, at the very least, be at the minimum of the range. Geographic differentials do impact the range assigned to a particular grade. So Huron does recommend training and education for employees to understand the reason for differences between colleges. So geographic differentials play a huge role in this market analysis. And so it's really important to understand why one college might have a different range than another one, again, based off of the cost of labor. And then GDIs, or geographic differential, should be evaluated on an annual basis, and then captured and evaluate the trend year to year to make sure that updates are made as necessary. So before going into the employee impact analysis and the cost for better market alignment, any questions so far on the market positioning for staff or faculty? Okay. So when it comes to the employee impact analysis and the cost associated, Huron did evaluate employee positioning, as we saw, within the proposed pay range, and provided associated costs for the different scenarios. So we're actually going to be taking a look at 3 specific scenarios. The first one is the alignment to pay range minimums. So that's the description there is staff and faculty members earning less than the range minimum are brought to the range minimum. The second scenario is alignment to pay range midpoint. So again, the midpoint represents the target market. And so how much would it be to bring an individual who's currently earning below the midpoint up to the midpoint? And then last is the proportional alignment to new range. So if staff and faculty members are brought to the new range, based on their current range penetration, using the current KCTCS salary schedule. If they were, say, 20% into the range, how much would it cost to bring them up 20% into the new structure based off of their position mapping? And so again, different scenarios, you will see pre-adjustment, each of the green dots account for a target employee. So if prior to the adjustment, they are below the range minimum, scenario 1, again, assumes that they will be making 80,000, for example, in this specific case or example. Scenario 2 is anyone or employees that are paid below the midpoint are brought to the midpoint. How much would that cost KCTCS? And then scenario 3 is all employees are brought to the new range minimum, or are brought to the range based on their position within the current pay range. So if they happen to be at the minimum of the current range, which would represent 0% range penetration, in the new structure or pay range, they will be at a 0% range penetration. If they're at 20%, they will be at 20%. So this is, again, accounting for same range penetration in the current state. Future state continues to be the same range penetration. So with that, the market alignment cost associated with each scenario is listed here, broken up by both staff and faculty. So again, scenario 1, bringing employees that are below the new range minimum up to the range minimum. For staff, that would be 4.3 million. And for faculty, again, I will say for faculty, all of this will change because of the revision to the pay structure that will happen based off of alignment on not accounting for discipline by grade, but instead by quartile. So 4.4 total for scenario 2, which is bringing them up to range midpoint, which is the target market. That will be 17.9 for staff, 2.1 for faculty. And then for scenario 3, that's proportional alignment, again, based on current range penetration, that would be 14.1 for staff and close to 500,000 for faculty. The alignment scenarios listed here do not consider any kind of reduction to employee pay. And also, this is very much focused on base pay increase only and does not reflect benefit load. So I'll pause right here and see what questions we have.
Just curious, and I don't expect it to be answered in this room. I'm just curious as to, as the market shifts and adjustments are made and these cost increases are applied to the overall organizational's bottom line, how do we then adjust for, changes in profitability or challenges to get back to original margins? But I'm not addressing this to Huron. I'm just talking out loud.
You mean, how do we pay for it?
Yeah, that's an easier way to say it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's what you were getting at.
In essence, that was my question. Yeah.
See, Joe's
But
not here.
that's a whole nother meeting. Just curious.
And I guess one comment I will make somewhat related to that is really to think about this, institutions do tend to take a phased approach, right? It's not a cost that immediately needs to take place. I think that's where the prioritization really comes into play to say, okay, based off of available budget, based off of the type of impact this will have on employees, what is the strategy KCTCS wants to implement? And then how can this take place over the course of, X number of years or by quarters. So there are different options in implementing this. And it could be definitely overwhelming looking at the cost here, but there's different strategies certainly to implement. And we've seen institutions do it in many different ways based off of budgetary restrictions.
Looks like James Lee has a question, and so does Joe.
Yes, in reference to going back to the staff that you have there, and you look at those bands, I'm wondering, and if my memory serves me correctly, there's 20 bands, but those upper level bands, say 15 through 20, are at the college level, or the presidents or senior senior personnel. And I'm wondering if, because when I look at the staff, maybe I shouldn't. I try to look at the entire picture, but I look at those lower level people or in the middle people to try to get them up is. So I'm just maybe concerned if you take from those last four, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, those bands, really how many people are in there. If we're talking about very few, that's fine. But if there's several in there at the systems office as well as the colleges, then that may make a little difference in my thinking is what I'm saying. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so definitely the bands being assigned at that job level, the higher the band, we see limited jobs there, meaning it's at times it can even be single encumbered jobs. So there tends to be less employees at those higher bands. And again, we're really looking at where they fall within the range. If they are, say, outside of the range, meaning they're below, then what does that cost to bring them up? And so I think it's really important to take a look at, the strategy again around increases as well, or any kind of the cost to evaluate that on an employee by employee basis and seeing and incorporating that as part of the overall strategy is really important. Again, with consistency being the key in the application of that strategy.
Does Huron collect any data around how organizations similar to ours have dealt with cost increase of this nature? I mean, so is there a data point that says 60% of the time people deal with the cost increases using method A versus method B versus method C?
I would say that's very hard to say because of just the different needs, even why Huron was called to begin with, right? So some of the things that some institutions would be dealing with is very different than another institution. So there may be the same in size, mission, type of 2-year institution, but the cost may also vary drastically. So very
Mhm.
difficult to say this is the approach. We do suggest, like I mentioned earlier, making sure that employees are paid within the range. That should definitely be a priority because, again, if they're performing the job, and ranges should truly reflect the, all plausible pay for a given job, not where they are in the range, but that they should at least be paid within the range. That tends to be a priority that we see across the board. Most institutions tend to prioritize. So we can certainly offer those types of insights, that type of insight. But when it comes to, an approach of saying, this type of institution tends to take a phased approach versus a one-time, it's very different because of the need that tends to emerge from each institution is very different. Susan, I'm not sure if you have additional thoughts there from what you've seen at other institutions.
Yeah, no, nothing additional, Calcadon. I think that was exactly right. No two institutions are the same. No two institutions approach this the same. But definitely know that you have options and different ways to think about it and approach it.
We have two people with their hands up. Joe, Hirding?
Yeah, what does it mean does not reflect benefit load?
So fringe benefits is not being considered here. This is truly just compensation related. And so any kind of benefits associated with benefits costs associated with the increase in base salary is not being accounted for. This is truly looking at it from a compensation lens.
I guess fringe benefits or benefits like, 401k or
Yes.
medical, that's not counted or is counted?
Is not counted.
So 43% basically is added on top of this if we have to pay for it, is what I'm hearing. If that's our benefits package, it's roughly 43%.
So there will be proportional, yes, there will be increases in benefits. So we're not looking at that employee by employee. So because of the focus on compensation only, additional cost would be incurred as part of, depending on which scenario do you decide to go with, yes.
Okay, I just think that's a really big
Yeah.
cost not to look at. It's that's not 20 million, that's 37 million.
Yeah, that's
basically.
we'll have to look at that when we decide. We'll have to factor that in.
Okay.
It's a good
Thank you.
point, Joe. Kim Green?
That actually leads into my question, Joe. I was going to ask, and it's 43%. So every person's salary, you add 43% to that, and that's what it costs for that person every fiscal year. So I know we've had conversations as a board within the last couple years about updating the benefits package. So I just wondered if that's still a consideration, and if it is, could there be any cost savings for the institution as well as the employees for benefits that might be a little more efficient?
Are you saying evaluate the benefit package to see if there's any means of efficiencies to?
Right, yes. If we are considering looking at the benefits package to see if there could be cost savings when we're talking about funding, and also to kind of streamline the benefits that we do have. We do have good benefits, but we have a lot of options and we work with a lot of carriers. And I know that's a good thing to offer our employees options, but sometimes it can be a little overwhelming to new hires, and it would definitely help with the HR execution of that if we could, maybe shore some of that up down the road. So, but from a funding standpoint, I was mainly asking about that. I know we've talked about looking at different options before, so I just was kind of curious to see if that's still on the radar.
So I probably am the better person to answer that than Huron because that's a little bit out of the scope of what they were doing. However, linking to Huron in the HR analysis portion, and Susan Basso is on here as well. Excuse me. We did talk about several things related to benefits and streamlining benefits, and Susan actually introduced me via email to some people. However, our HR transition team felt it really important to get a strategic vision for benefits. So we advertised for, interviewed someone for the director of benefits, and actually extended an offer. And before she came to work, she declined the offer ultimately, and said she would not be able to come. So we're back to square one on that. But that person's first order of business was to begin working on a inventory of all of our benefits, coordinating with any vendors that we needed to coordinate with, and taking a look at our overall package. In addition to that, however, we have put out for a supplemental vendor broker. We put out an RFP, and I believe that we have selected one and are negotiating a contract with that company. So all of the supplemental benefits that are kind of out there all over the place will now flow through that particular vendor. Additionally, our benefits area, the operational side of it, has moved over to payroll, and payroll and HR are partnering to really streamline the actual application for benefits, creating a benefits portal, etc. So the ultimate answer is we're working internally and with Huron to try and determine where we go next steps with benefits, but there is movement on that, Regent Green.
Thank you, Pam. And I just want to clarify, that was kind of to piggyback on the question about, how we're going to pay for this. So when Calcadon mentioned total rewards at the beginning, that's kind of where my mind went. And I just want to ask too, and I apologize if I missed this, but we are not, through this presentation, we're not considering executive level compensation or that particular policy. That's correct? Okay.
That is correct. Yes.
Okay.
Out of scope. Yeah.
Okay. One last question. For the base pays that we've been talking about, was there a portion of the study that did look at overloads, supplemental pay, things like that could, while they are not a part of the base salary, create inequities?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So when it comes to overload, we're really taking a look at it from current state practice and what we would typically expect to see and provide opportunities. So that's going to be covered in the final presentation when we look at all of the opportunities when it comes to current state compensation. These costs specifically just focused on base pay, but to your point, very much if we're taking a look at outside of base pay, that market positioning can look very different, right? So we will have opportunities when it comes to the application and use of overload currently with both faculty, and knowing that it also takes place with staff, and identifying opportunities there. But when it comes to the data and the cost associated with it, typically we would focus on base pay there, because that's guaranteed versus the supplemental or overload, which tends to fluctuate. So there will be insight around that in the final presentation, but primary focus on here, or it's not accounted in this presentation, I should say.
Thank you.
So when it comes to market alignment considerations, based on the presented costs, we did want to outline some key considerations for KCTCS, and that is really that the implementation for these costs or these different scenarios, depending on which one is selected, should really evaluate the financial and strategic impact of the investment in employee pay, and also selecting a prioritization option. So we do recommend that the implementation approach that's selected is shared across the system to ensure that employees do have the same opportunity for market alignment, regardless of what college they sit in or are located in. And also implementation, like I mentioned, can take place in a phased approach based on the selected prioritization option. So with clear communication of KCTCS's approach, employees can recognize that the system is making an effort to prioritize employee compensation. And then additional implementation planning consideration, the roadmap associated with it would also be presented after the conclusion of the equity analysis, which is currently taking place. So in light of that result, we'll be able to provide some opportunities, but also prioritization options that we would recommend based off of what we typically see and a roadmap associated with that. So with implementation planning, prior to implementation, we do want to outline that there is multiple decision points that need to be addressed to ensure that this is a successful program. So again, prioritizing is really important, and that there needs to be an alignment on the approach that's taken for this new compensation program. Also operationalizing it, there's going to be a lot of downstream impacts. We see this with these engagements all the time, whether that's system implementations or the use of current job codes and what that plays into. So really important to have that resource and partner with key stakeholders to make sure that those are resolved. And then last is really the communication. So communicating project outcomes, the impact, the implementation plan with employees and other stakeholders is going to go a long way to ensure that there is proper understanding behind the decisions that are made, but also making sure that there's necessary buy-in for this initiative. Again, additional information on implementation planning, the roadmap will be shared after the equity analysis is complete. So for next steps, Huron will finalize the compensation playbook based off of the discussion with various stakeholders. Like mentioned, we will share that information with you. And then we will also share the results of the equity analysis. The next meeting first with the PLT will take place October 4th. And we also have a meeting scheduled with all of you on the 9th. And that's when we'll be able to have the final report. So that would include the equity analysis, some additional insight around overload pay, faculty promotion process, also the revision of the faculty pay structure, and really have all of that implementation planning associated with that. So we'll share that at the next presentation. And so the next agenda item is around the HR assessment findings. So based off of the compensation and equity workstream, there was an extension of work to really evaluate HR operation and evaluate the entire HR function. That was a 10-week engagement, so we were able to conclude that, and we have some high-level summary to highlight some of the findings there. So we really began by conducting a focus group and an interview with selected stakeholders that are either in HR or have very close interaction with HR. So some of the themes from that interview and focus group are outlined here. Three key themes here. The first one is around HR operational design and HR customer service. The second one is around HR process technology and data. And the last one is around talent strategy. So when we take a look at HR operational design and HR customer service, that's really focusing on being able to evaluate and look at the strategy, the structure, and the partnership that currently takes place. So the identified opportunities really focused on the creation of an HR strategy that is aligned to the organization's mission and vision. So tying KCTCS mission and vision to the HR strategy and having it be clearly defined so that there could be a common practice across the system and HR operations. Also, defined roles and responsibilities between the system office and college HR to increase the synergy and partnership and the quality of service that is being offered. And then the second theme is around HR process technology and data, and that, you know, a lot of the interviewees and focus group participants mentioned that there are some opportunities for enhanced HR in order to integrate technology with HR operations and ensuring accuracy of data. So the primary call-outs include the integration of systems that house information and using that across the employee life cycle, from interviewing all the way to exit. And then also increased level of access for HR leaders to improve efficiencies and effectiveness in the HR business processes, and improve availability of accurate HR data. And then last is talent strategy, which really encompasses both talent acquisition and talent management. So that talent strategy can be enhanced through recruitment, talent management, DEI, efforts, and then also the identified opportunities around this space include improving branding with an emphasis on culture to be able to attract and retain. You know, based off of a lot of the employee engagement surveys that have been conducted by the different at the college level, a lot of the findings were, you know, employees, you know, work at KCTCS because they believe in the mission. There is a very high score related to engagement with the mission of the institution. So from a recruiting standpoint and retention standpoint, that is a very key thing to emphasize, and there's a lot of opportunities there. So that was even called out by focus group participants and interviewees. There was also additional call out of just being proactive around DEIB goals and objectives. And so all of that really kind of emerged in that focus group and interview themes. The second part of the assessment really focused on assessing KCTCS HR operations using Huron's HR maturity scale. So the HR function was measured on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being initial, 5 being transformational, and 3 being where we typically see organizations. So think of that as the midpoint as defined. So just to give you an idea of what would be considered initial, that would be HR operations that are primarily focused on HR processing. They may have compliance risk, really tend to be reactive versus proactive. Foundational is core HR services are offered, but there is limited technology integration. Also, you know, some compliance risk identified. Defined tends to be compliance risk are managed. Core HR services are established, really thinking about this from the employee life cycle, but from a operational standpoint tends to be reactive. Then there's leading and transformational. When you start getting into the scale 4 or leading, that tends to be very much proactive. So a proactive operations, compliance risks are proactively managed. HR services are supported through the entire employee life cycle, and business decisions are driven based off of data and technology. And transformational, few organizations there, but truly tends to be data-driven, proactive, leading in the sense that leading compared to competitors tends to be that example that most institutions tend to look for when it comes to HR operations. So with that 1 to 5, we took a look at the different HR dimensions, again, within the HR function. And those include the role of HR. So what does HR look like? What role do they have within the organization? HR process and technology, again, the integration, the internal controls that exist, talent strategy and talent acquisition, both from under that talent management umbrella, DEI being included in there, career pathing, the opportunity to progress, the employer branding, the use of sourcing for recruiting, and then we get to engagement and development, the type of training that's available for employees, how the use of performance management and having performance being driven and compensated appropriately for high performance, total rewards, both encompassing compensation and benefits. And then the last two dimensions are service delivery and cost of delivery, which is really getting at the customer experience, how quickly stakeholders are able to receive services from HR. And then the cost of delivery is really measuring the productivity, people cost, vendors, etc. So we evaluated each of these dimensions within the HR function using the scale that I showed on the previous slide, 1 through 5. And this was really based off of, data that we gathered, data that was submitted, the interviews, the focus groups, and then benchmarking that based off of what we would typically see as leading institutions. So before showing the score for each of these components, I do want to say that the data collected was across the system. So for 16 different colleges, we saw some colleges really excelling in some of these dimensions over others. And so the score that you will see is an average of all 16. So we're looking at this as a system, but knowing that there are some colleges that are truly, putting heavy emphasis on talent acquisition, for example, and having really robust training and development for staff. So the score here is really across the system on average. So with that said, the average score for KCTCS's HR function, considering all 8 dimensions, is at a 2.4. So Huron does recommend a focus primarily on talent management. So that's really that strategy and acquisition piece of it, and HR business process, the modification to HR business processes to enable KCTCS to progress to the next stage. So we would recommend for the more immediate a focus to get to that 3, and then over time to becoming leading. So you will see in each of these, some tend to be a little bit higher than others. So total rewards where benefits, certainly a very good benefits package, but compensation, which is in progress, but this was evaluated based on the current state, has some opportunities. Talent acquisition being the biggest one, very different processes taking place across the system on recruiting and being able to get the right talent in the door. So opportunities there. And then same with talent strategy and the role of HR, thinking about, what is the role of HR at KCTCS? What is the vision and how is that tied to the overall KCTCS mission and vision? As part of this engagement, actually, I'll pause right here before going into the policy and procedure. Any questions on the score for the different dimensions of the HR assessment? Okay. So the other part of this engagement was really looking at the HR policy and procedures and the review around that. So we really identified an opportunity to standardize, also, hone in on some of the specific details. There was a lot of reoccurring comments around policies and procedures, specific policies that were called out for revision. So we wanted to emphasize those and also take a look at this from a compliance standpoint, knowing that some of the policies haven't been reviewed in over 10 years. There are those that we prioritized based off of the last update to make sure that those updates take place and are up to date so that we reduce compliance risk. When it comes to standardization, though, do want to call out that there are opportunities to improve HR operations through the standardization and policies and procedures, and knowing that there are nuances that exist, and that there are different procedures that are taking place at the college level and happen to have different operation between colleges. Again, that could be fine to accommodate some of the different nuances that exist at colleges, but from an operation standpoint, without that clear strategy, without that clear vision, it becomes difficult to understand and operate in a similar fashion tied to that mission. And then focus group and interviews really called out specific policies and processes, the PPE being the primary one, and also the remote work policy, where some colleges have a lot more flexibility than others, creating a sense of inequity between employees, even though it's under KCTCS one umbrella, very different policies associated with remote work. And then when we get to identified opportunities, there are a total of 5 that we really wanted to call out. The first one, I've already mentioned it, is really that HR strategy and philosophy, being able to develop an HR strategy that becomes the foundation for HR commitment for the entire system. And it's the vision that really drives that operation strategically. Also, the role of HR, defining KCTCS HR structure and dissecting the HR efforts to ensure that services are provided efficiently based on the developed HR strategy and philosophy. So we noticed that there's a lot of practices that are both transactional and strategic within the same role. Are there opportunities to be able to have certain groups really focus on that strategy piece of HR, and other groups focusing on more the operational, others more on the transactional? These happen to be really shared across the board. And what are the specific competencies needed for individuals to be successful in those types of roles? If those competencies currently don't exist, what are the types of training that could be implemented to equip those who hold those positions currently? So really having an opportunity around the role of HR and evaluating that. Also, HR business processes, establishing very clear HR process documentation and knowledge management. Currently, there is a lot of college level procedures for certain actions, even with around recruiting, job postings. How can we make sure that that type of process there could be a knowledge management around those processes and shared and operated consistently, so that customer experience that we've heard from focus groups, varying depending on what college you are, could have the same experience across the system. Talent management, again, designing a talent management strategy that's tied to specific levers. There's a lot of opportunities here, even being able to have a shared talent pool. A lot of colleges are close in proximity. If there is one candidate that isn't necessarily a good fit for one position, they can certainly be a good fit for another position at a different college. So how could we have a shared talent pool that could save a lot of time between colleges and reduce effort? And then last is policies and procedures, being able to identify key policies that should be prioritized, and selecting parameters and having a regular cadence to reviewing these policies and procedures to make sure that updates are taking place on a regular basis, and that those policies are consistent and those procedures are consistent across the system. So that was a lot of information. Any questions on the HR assessment? Yes, Regent Green.
I'm pleased to hear the term consistency and consistent when it comes to procedures, policies, things of that nature, because I think the more consistency we have across the system, the more capable we are in HR of delivering the customer service, delivering the type of service that we want to be able to. You should be able to walk into any HR office at any college and be able to follow the same process, use the same form. There shouldn't be a question about, from this HR office at this college, how are we going to implement this? There should already be something in place, or be working on something that is going to be in place that everyone else can use. And I know with the the HR leadership, they will talk frequently about, things that one college is doing that another college is doing that's beneficial. So I think when we do find something that is really good, maybe that needs to be spread across the system and everybody implement that. We spend a lot of time trying to come up with ways to do certain things, develop process and procedure, and I think we're a little redundant in doing that. So I'm glad to see that. I'm glad to hear that.
And I do want to say a lot of the recommendations, especially around the talent management space, is already taking place at some of the colleges, to your point. And so, how can we make sure that we take those key highlights and make sure that, that's something that is offered and can be a common practice across all colleges to create that same consistency that you mentioned. Okay. If there are no more questions, the last update is around the optimization workstream. So I will hand it over to you, Chris.
Thanks. Thanks for that great update on all that great work. We wanted to just give a quick update on the work that is happening on the optimization side. As you're probably aware, we had a contract signed to help with implementation starting about a month ago. That will take us through the end of this year. And it's really focused on 3 key areas from our work from the spring and summer. The first is establishing the project management office. The second is looking at org structures, more detailed. And third is the academic programming deep dives. One thing I wanted to stress is that 2 of these 3 work streams are really helping to make sure that our work from prior phase, now you all can start leading things and driving those things and not need to rely on Huron as much. The first being that project management office. The goal is that we will stand this up in the next month or 2, get all the layers needed in place, all the structures in place, and then pass that over to you all. I know that there is a position that's going to be filled internally or posted internally to get that filled, and then we'll pass that over to you all, and then you all can run with that project management office and lead that effort. The second one is the academic programming deep dives. We built the model, and it's really complex, and we identified a lot of opportunities for you all. But we need to loop in the CAOs. They hadn't been as involved on the details of the model, and maybe hadn't been as involved on looking at implementation of some of the opportunities identified. So we're really trying to loop in those CAOs. We're having one-on-one meetings with each of them to coach them through how they can use the model for their specific college. And then we're doing some workshops around some of those key opportunities identified: faculty credit hour production, low enrolled sections, looking at programmatic offerings and things like that. And again, we identified the opportunities, but now we need to help them help themselves on implementing those. So the workshops are really intended on coaching them through that process. So again, 2 of the 3 are really focused on helping you all help yourselves, so you don't need to be as reliant on Huron moving forward. And then the third one is looking at org structures. We've been working really closely with Hannah, so thank you so much, Hannah, for your help there. The first big step is deploying what we call the Huron Activity Administrative Study. We call it HOS for short. And really just trying to understand the number of FTEs by function out at each of the colleges. And once we have that detailed data, however many it be, 55 FTEs of HR and 78 FTEs of finance or whatever it be, we then have a good understanding of what the options for org structures are. We've talked about some shared service options. We've talked about some regional pod models. We've looked at maybe there's some consolidation of certain administrative efforts. We don't know exactly what the different options will be. We really need to see what that data comes back with and help us plan. So if you go to the next slide, Calcadon, just give you a quick overview of the timeline here. We started a few weeks ago, and Pam helped us get a lot of data to get this stood up. And again, Hannah's been really helpful on the org side of things. We've been working to get the PMO office stood up, and then in the next month or two, as that resource identify, we'll transition it to them and they can run with it from there. The org structure work, that administrative study goes through, will be about a month from now. We'll get all that data. Then we can think through what the options are for shared services or regional models or whatever it be. And then the academic deep dives, our first one-on-one session with CAOs starts tomorrow. Our workshops go through October and November, with the plan for that to wrap up in December. Any questions or comments there? Yeah, Pam?
So I would be remiss in not recognizing Chelsea Young from my office, who has been the one really pulling all this data together for me while I've been in other meetings.
Yes, I think I said Hannah, and I think I maybe meant to say Chelsea. I
I was going to
apologize.
take all of that credit, but now that Pam's called it out, I guess I will give credit to Chelsea.
Well, I know I got credit and I did not want that credit because Chelsea has done so much of the work.
Yeah, I appreciate everyone there. And then one last update that's not here on this slide, but we were asked to present the work from January through the summer, specifically on the optimization side, to the legislators. That is next week. So me, Veronica, Jennifer, Calcadon are going to the state legislators next Tuesday with Pam to present. We have about 10 or so slides, kind of executive summary slides of the work to date. All of its content you've seen and heard, but just wanted to give you that level of transparency that we would be meeting with them. So hope it goes well. Wish us luck. And that's it on my end.
How much of the information is going to be privy to the legislature? I mean, is it just curtailed to what you provide, or just curious?
They've actually already received, if I may, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to jump in, Chris, but if the full 244 page report was shared with the entire General Assembly.
Okay.
I'm not sure how many of them have read it. But I have had a few of them mention it to me and ask for more. And obviously they requested this presentation at the Education Committee meeting. It was Senator West who had requested it. So at least a few of them are familiar with it and want to know more about it.
Can you send all of the board the presentation so we'll know, just in case?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's about 10 or 12 slides so far, really just trying to condense all of our work, and then we'll just field any questions that they have. But we'll share that with you all so you know kind of how we're framing it and what we're showing.
Okay, appreciate it.
But it is all slides you've seen.
And just to clarify, this focuses on the resource optimization phase of it, not on the class and comp or the HR analysis.
Okay. I said we've seen a lot of slides, so it'd be nice
yes,
if you would just consolidate those down to whatever they're going to see.
For sure, we'll do.
Okay. So is that the end of your presentation?
Yeah, I think that's it, unless there's any other questions.
Okay. Is there any other questions? Anybody? Any of the other participants?
Barry, just real quick, I want to verify when we can expect to see the playbook and then this full report. Can we have access to this as well?
Yes, so for this, the slides shared today, we can send that out, work with Pam and Hannah to get that out. The compensation playbook, we're making modifications based off of feedback from last week, but we should be able to have that before the next meeting, which is scheduled for October 9th. So we'll be able to have that ahead of time so that you have a chance to review it. And if you do have any specific questions, we'll be able to address it during that meeting.
And I'd like to I'd like to apologize for me being late. I'm glad Amy reminded me. I was actually on the road. So sorry for being late for the meeting. Any other questions?
No.
Okay. When is our next update with Huron? When is it scheduled?
So the next meeting specifically for the compensation one would be October 9th.
Okay.
Yep.
And that's when you'll have these adjustments that you proposed? Okay.
Correct. Exactly. Yep.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's good information for us to have as discussion points for our board meeting next week as well. So.
Yeah, Barry, that was actually what I was kind of insinuating, or we will get this perhaps before the board meeting. So while we're all together as a group, that we would be able to discuss what we're seeing.
Yes. Yeah. We can
Okay.
certainly have that and prioritize to make sure that you have it ahead of time. Yep.
Great. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
I think I have those 3 options etched in my mind. So. Okay. Well, thank you, Huron, for all your work, and thanks for the update and all the staff. We really appreciate all the work and effort into this. If we don't have any other questions, we'll conclude the meeting.
We need a motion to adjourn and a second.
Second.
And by consensus.
Aye.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Huron.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Good to see everybody.